Okay, so we're speaking here with Bonnitta Roy and Jonathan Rowson, and we're talking about Bonnita's new, let's say, it seems like a manifesto to me on some level, even though that's a rather dramatic way of putting it. But we are living in dramatic times, and the article for Emerge is called Corona-19, A Tale of Two Systems. Bonnitta, you wrote this article proposing that you had 6 steps towards creating a new kind of prosperity, okay, in light of the crisis that's going on and systems collapse and what can sort of come next. And one of them was expand our political economic imagination, design a global commons in service to life, experience the deeper sources of connection, expand circles of trust and concern, reinvent education for the future, and pivot to digital naturalism. So that's a lot of stuff. And you also divide, you're dividing the current systems of the world into 2 systems, 2 worlds. So in a way, we're living in 2 worlds, and one world is sort of doomed, and the other world has some kind of possibility. So is that enough for you to work and kind of introduce your vision, Bonnitta?
Yeah, I think we should back up. And so that was interesting. So I think that reflected like how the article might have impacted you. But I want to start with something Jonathan said when he asked me to make a contribution on Corona. And I think you said it, like it's a lot of stuff. And Jonathan said, why is this list important? Like, there's all kinds of lists people put up, and I really appreciated that feedback, because I feel the same way. Like, why these 5 things? Why not those 5 things? Or why these? And so maybe we can backtrack and kind of frame it in. Jonathan was looking at the drafts in the process and his invitation. So maybe we can start with that.
I'll just briefly speak to that. So, I mean, I run a charity in London called Perpectivia, and it was co-founded with Thomas Bjorkman, who some of your viewers will know. And we, 3 or 4 years ago, began to realize that if you want to understand complex systems, you need to also bring in the soul somehow. And that part of the problem with a lot of thinking was that you could have a sort of view of systems thinking and economic change and political change on the one hand, and you also had people talking about personal transformation and spiritual growth on the other, and they were not very often talking to each other. There were communities where they were, but even in those conversations, it wasn't clear how productive and creative the conversations were. There was a sense in which people had their natural biases. Either they want to speak about all the things we should do to the economic model, or they were more inclined to talk about stages of human spiritual maturation and the kinds of practices we should do to get there. And Perspectiva was founded partly to make sense of that connection and realize that it's a long-term conversation. We call ourselves an urgent 100-year project for that reason, because we recognize that, systems are complex enough as in any given case. Then you have multiple systems interlocking as we do at the moment. But you also have the kind of interiority of the systems. And so when you bring all those things together, you get a very deliciously complex, but often hard to communicate set of insights and ideas. Mm-hmm. And there aren't that many people who can sort of play at that level, if you like. Bonnita's certainly one of them. Zachary Stein, whom we asked to write for us as well, was another. And they appear on the Emerge website because Emerge is part of Perspectiva. We were part of the creation of it, and over time we've taken more and more responsibility towards it. In due course, the distinction is basically that Emerge is meant to be relatively accessible. Emerge is designed to be reaching a large audience, whereas Perspectiva is maybe a little bit more challenging, precise, intellectually exacting. And so in an ideal world, we get these pieces pitched and refined and edited so they can reach many people. But then we talk further as we are here and drill down in a bit more depth and clarity about what's being said.
Right. Because one of the things that Bonnitta mentions, I think, often is the danger of, let's say, very reductive thinking. And I guess the danger of a manifesto, in a sense, and I'm calling it that. You didn't call it that, but it does have let's say, a vision to it. One of the dangers is this kind of reductionism. So I wonder if we're living in a time where, there is the danger of a very, very quick. We're living in a time that's very urgent on one hand, and at a time that requires very careful thought at the other. And maybe that's the line, or that's the tension.
Yeah, so I want to call it a holofesto.
Okay.
So it works like a manifesto, but it has a holistic kind of view instead of a reductive view. So if you want to keep calling it something, we can call it a holofesto. So here's where we need to be careful. There is reductionism. That's like scientific reductionism. So we abstract from experience down to concepts, and then we can manipulate the concepts as if they stand in for the whole. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. Now, the postmodern systemic mind moves away from that kind of reductionism toward what we would call synthetic systems making. So larger and larger systems, more and more points to contextualize, transdisciplinary kind of integrations and syntheses. And these build hyperobjects, right? So it's not reductionist, but it has its own liability. There's no pivot point in which to act. You can't get in there, okay?
That's what I wanted to actually bring up, is like you mentioned in your email that you wanted this stuff to be actionable.
Yeah. So then what's the third way, right? If we don't want to build hyperobjects, and I'm not saying all the first two are not necessary. I'm saying that they each give us valuable insight into what we're dealing with. But there's this third way, and this third way it's a move into the felt sense, a move into the body, a move into like getting real with what is your despair, or what is possible from here. Like, what is simply possible from here? And as Jonathan knows, I went through this process with this article, because first it was big and synthetic, and I hated it because it was just a clever use of your mind in a certain way. So what is being asked of me? What is being asked of me at this point in history? And from there, and this article emerges. And so, for example, I'll just give you how it can play out. After I wrote the article, I was in the process of doing these community calls with various different groups for once a week for 3 weeks. And in this one group, someone said, I'm working with so-and-so, and we're building blockchain technology to recreate the whole U.S. economy. And, he's a very bright person. And then he said, but the problem, of course, is only, not even 20% of people will actually get it. They're too stupid. And I said, we don't need sophisticated financial instruments. We need simple financial instruments that everyone can understand, that are guaranteed to work for them. You see the difference? Now, it took me a long time. Actually, not until I wrote this article did even I get it. Because I was like chasing like more and more complexity and this and that. And when I realized that we could just have a simple everyone understands how to do this, that didn't have to take down the whole economy, I thought, oh my God, what if I thought more like this? Maybe there's a lot hidden in plain sight, a lot of potential in plain sight. But this is a different kind of thinking. And I don't, want to go meta on the thinking. One of your audience will. There's a whole nother, PhD in that. But this is like, for me, what the invitation is that Jonathan is looking for. And like Zach does the same, he does a similar thing, but it's orthogonal to, like he said, I think on your video, I didn't even propose anything. I wasn't even arguing for anything. He took something from inside of himself and put it in the context of this. And so this is, I think, what Jonathan has a nose for. But anyway.
It's something like imaginal is the word that comes to mind. This is a word I got from John Vervaeke. He talks the difference between imagination, just imagining all these things and kind of going into a fantasy of how the world could be, whereas actual concrete imaginal, I think that's what Zach was doing. He was putting forth imaginal structures that we could work with rather than, let's say, a research paper or something like that. Did you want to respond, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot going on, and it's fascinating to hear the process angle on what's being said before we get delving into the material of it, the substance of it. I've been going through a little bit of a trip myself for the last few weeks because I've encountered, partly through Bonnita's essay, where she used the word originary. When she used this word originary, I thought she'd made a typo, right? Which is kind of embarrassing, but an embarrassment I'm happy to own up to. Originary is actually a term from Jean Gebser, and it's a really important notion. And it's usefully juxtaposed with imaginary. And you've mentioned the imaginal, Andrew. So to sort of frame these different notions, the imaginary is often the sort of the kind of like the inside of the whole world. The imaginary is something like how we experience culture writ large, and how it circumscribes our notion of what's normal. The imaginary is that which it's several layers of abstraction beyond your immediate experience and your culture. It's kind of a holding pattern for subjective and intersubjective experience. And there are ways of describing it. I think Charles Taylor calls it the widest possible grasp of our whole predicament, right? So that's imaginary. And a lot of people have been speaking recently about the need for a new social imaginary, because the imaginary we have is basically a consumerist, late capitalist, world falling apart imaginary. And maybe we can do better, right? That's one of the ideas out there. But there's a richer, deeper, perhaps more profound notion, which is connected with the evolution of consciousness, which is sort of saying, look, these imaginaries will either be given unto us by processes of history, mostly material processes, like what's happening to land, what's happening with technology, what's happening with population movements. They will give rise to subjective and intersubjective experience, right? And that keeps on happening. And so we get to a point now where suddenly we become aware, hang on, we're caught in this thing called the imaginary. What's going on? Can we change it? Are we subject to it? Is there a sense in which we can build our own imaginary? Yeah. That's a highly non-trivial process, because it's like, a spider web being reconstructed after it's broken down. You're coming out of something kind of natural and process driven, and claiming that you can, through a sort of effort of will, recreate it. And it's highly questionable that we can, which is where the idea of the originary becomes interesting. Because in effect, you're saying, look more deeply at those processes, follow them back to where they started. Look at the origin, right? And this is where it gets deep, which is, what kind of origin? Well, mathematical origin, certainly. Mathematical becoming physical, becoming chemical, becoming biological, becoming evolution, becoming psychological, becoming spiritual. But arguably, right at the beginning, it was numinous.
Yeah.
This gets into sort of theological order. But the whole idea of the origin living on, Gebser's famous book is called The Ever-Present Origin. And I'm still grappling with Gebser. I don't want to give any sort of false authority here, but I'm excited by his work because it tallies with a lot of other thinkers. Mark Vernon, who's also an associate of Perpectivia, has done great work in bringing Owen Barfield to public attention.
Yeah.
There's something different about participatory knowing. But as Bonnie, I think, was alluding to earlier, getting away from a way of knowing that is sort of abstract and sort of about mental models and getting back into the world, rediscovering your original tacit understanding of things, but no longer in a naive way, recognizing that they're situated within these cultural contexts, these imaginal contexts, but no longer being as subject to them, being able to somehow get back to, it's like in the Zen tradition, they speak of before enlightenment carrying water, chopping wood, after enlightenment carrying water, chopping wood. So the originary for me, this notion is quite a profound one. It's something like saying there is a challenge with our social imaginary, but the essence of the challenge is that we have to find a way to rediscover the originary, the sort of origin of this process of creation and recreation that we're caught up in. Yeah. And now become conscious agents of that in some way. And how? We don't know. But that's where we are, I think.
That's wonderful. And before you speak on that, Bonnita, I remember in your article you mentioned something about how you compared sort of the project of going to the moon, right? As this is something that the American ego felt like it needed to do to go to the moon, like land on the moon, right? To find itself, to be something. Whereas you were saying that our task right now, and this is just putting simply what Jonathan is saying about the originary, is to just step on the earth. Like that's the more difficult task that we have to do. Does that ring true? Is that a good segue to what Jonathan was saying?
Yeah. So I wasn't critiquing the moonshot.
Yeah, sorry. That was my critique.
Yeah.
Not yours, excuse me.
It's interesting because I linked that speech and many people emailed me and they were blown away. Like there are young people who never see leaders talk like that. So whether you think it, whatever your retrospective historical critique on those times is, that's not how it was playing out at the time. So, but now it's a different, it's a different need. It's a different calling. It's a different aspiration, let's say. It's, and for me, like part of what I said in the last part about digital naturalism is a lot of what we need to do is hidden in plain sight. But our way of thinking about intelligence and development means that everything in the future and more complexity is progress, represents progress. This is not surprising because we live in a competitive growth economy based on information. So we escalate the complexity of information, regardless of whether it's in the right direction. So we don't really, in general, this is true in organizations as well as individuals, in general, we don't create organizations that are committed to a task. In the past, organizations would commit to a task, they'd build something, and then they would die out. Now we create organizations that are committed to the lifelong profit of the organization. Doesn't matter what the task is. Mm-hmm. So very few people get really clean on what's the task? What are we trying to do? And so the moonshot's perfect. It's very clear. We're going to the moon. All the learnings and all the other things are inside that commitment and that goal. Mm. So, and of
so we
course,
need that kind of, you're saying we need that kind of direction, that kind of intense, direction. Even that sounds like a grand narrative that we need, though. Going to the moon is a big project, right? So I'm saying there's kind of a paradox in what you're saying is that we don't want to be too grandiose about our project, but it has to be a grand project.
So I have a thought.
Yeah.
If I may. It reminds me of a famous distinction by he teaches at the Harvard Kennedy School called Ron Heifetz. And he distinguishes between technical problems and adaptive problems, or technical challenges and adaptive challenges, to be precise. And he says that so much of leadership makes the mistake of treating adaptive challenges as technical problems, that most leadership errors stem from that mistake. And I know this would not apply to Bonnie, but it's an interesting juxtaposition. When you think of the moonshot, it's true that that rallied a lot of attention and imagination and excitement. The Earth became somehow object rather than subject because we could escape from it. And then we could look down on it and see how beautiful it was. And that's a huge achievement. So it's not simply technical. But it's also true that the problem of how to get to the moon is technical in nature. Whereas the problem of how do you design governance structures and viable economies for roughly 8 billion people on an ecologically compromised and technologically imperious world, that's not a technical problem. That's an adaptive challenge at scale. And so while we do need a new moonshot in spirit, it will have to be a very different kind of endeavor. It's an endeavor in which we're thoroughly implicated, not as bystanders, but as participants.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you could speak to that, Bonnie.
Yeah.
About what principles and what should we do? Again, as you say, you wanted this to be very action-based. So people are always, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of podcasts.
Yeah.
What should the actions be? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that was beautiful. So I completely agree with what Jonathan said, and I'm actually learning really rich perspectives on this. So I'm going to call it one-stop shopping. You see, the difference between the moonshot and the way we're working now is the way we're working now is very fractionalized, right? So this group of the voting population wants free education. This group wants this group wants that, this group wants that. And so there's no one that holds a vision. So the moonshot created alignment. It created new economic opportunity. It created the need for a lot of growth in the computer sector, which was starting up, but didn't really have a challenge. It created this, it rearranged the geosocial world big time. It created the opportunity for GPS, all these things. It also created a great opportunity for women at the time, which is underreported. So it's like one-stop shopping. What is a moonshot that naturally aggregates or creates holistic interdependencies so you get more bang for your buck? So to me, that was like, so what are the, I think I started with 12, some of them were enfolded in others. What could be something like that? And so that's how we come with the 6. So for example, and I tried to take things that were doable and emerging already. So the notion of a citizen's currency is very much embedded in a lot of work that people are doing with digital currency, but also with PayPal. I mean, when PayPal came online, it was extraordinary because up until then, the SEC, the Security and Exchange Committee, would have shut them down without a doubt because you couldn't build your own kind of currency thing. It wasn't a bank per se. These imaginaries, these expansion of our economic imagination, there's lots in the system already. But as I said earlier, it's like, what is the easiest one? What is the low-hanging fruit that we could just do today? Now, coronavirus has given us an opportunity to remind people that they're interested now in their food chain. And it'd be easy. In fact, some of us have been researching apps. There's really cool apps to find, to watch your food chain and have that currency be off the value-added investment interest currency. And that would be UBI, would be a better type of UBI because it would not be subject to the extractive financial instruments in the main economy. So can we just move the needle there? Now all of a sudden, what happens? A lot happens. If you could get your, let's say, healthcare and food from this currency, and then let's say you keep rent and housing and mortgages on the other currency, and then your landlord tells you to, you can't pay your rent. Your landlord says, get out, or don't pay your rent or get out. Well, you say, well, I'll get out. Like, you're so much more fluid now. So the rental charge, all the pressure will now be on renters. They would be competing with themselves. And there's a lot of young people who like to go back into rural areas and build farms, but they can't because you'll starve to death. Basically, it takes like 10 years. But if you had your health care and your food paid for, then you'd get rural revitalization. If you had this local currency for healthcare, you could get a lot of more healthcare services like they do in, I think, Amsterdam. There's something it's not Morningstar, but where you have local knowledge for certain kind of healthcare outside of the insurance system. Chiropractic started that way. Homeopathic started that way. So just to show you how big a deal this is, when I left my job and lost my health care, I got a very bad injury in my arm. I needed like 120 internal stitches and 80 external stitches, antibiotics, and an x-ray. But I didn't have health insurance, so I didn't get a surgeon. I got a medical technician who'd done 2 tours in Iraq. He did a beautiful job, and it cost me $1,900. That's it. That's the true cost of healthcare. A certain amount of artisan vocational knowledge, and X amount of hours in a room, in an office. So, but this can't happen when it's run on the extractive system, because you get the taxes, you get the interest, you get the loans, you get the insurance companies. All of this inflates the cost of health insurance. So our government, for example, in the U.S., we want universal health care. But we're not going to pay the healthcare workers. We're going to pay the insurers. So universal healthcare under the existing system means universal raping of your labor into insurance profits. So that just one move can start to peel away. It re-incentivizes just natural human activity in the way we want. So that's why it's not just all of these, I think, have multiple leverage points and support each other. So maybe we could just do the other ones in a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. So basically, once people have a baseline of survival, without the fear of being hungry, and if we diversified money so that, or value, or into something called a citizen's currency, then you were suggesting that the both systems, like we would have different systems of money, different kinds of currencies of systems, and that would this diversification would allow us to be more natural in our activities.
I think the diversification itself would enable us to take a look at the extractive economy that we have, the central banking economy.
Yeah.
And so so that's also another advantage. Do this, and now you can see, do we need this? And maybe there are advantages, so it's like, it's different than becoming more and more complex and trying to see how I'm going to solve everything at once. It's like, this is doable. It's right in front of our face. I even talked about like people having reports, quarterly reports of where the money's going. Farmers needed it here. These farmers didn't need it, and you could start to see currency as this network effect.
Wow.
So I see promise in that idea, but I also see lots of potential qualms. And I'm sure Bonnie herself, were someone else to propose these ideas, she would be quick to see that there are perspectives that need to be brought to bear. For example, is this happening in one country alone? And if it is, that creates certain even greater immigration pressures on that country. It also will impact on Is it okay for the central government to allow, in effect, multiple money supplies? What will that mean for things like inflation and interest rates on mortgages and so forth? I'm not sort of bona fide economist, although I've spent enough time reading economics books. But I know that there are economists who would be interesting to ask about these things. This is quite an interesting conversation in the sense that economics is too important to be left to just the economists on the one hand. But it's also true that once you get an idea like, here's an app for a new idea of a currency, and we can tailor make it to some parts of the economy which are essential and keep it out of the parts of the economy which are about revenue extraction and make interest and debt and all the rest of it. Now, I think maybe, I'm very open to it, but I'm also keen to stress that we don't really know. So this is the difference between Bonnie having an interesting idea, let's explore it, let's see what it looks like. But that's very different from saying, here's a solution. It's much more about saying, here's a different way of thinking about money and technology and human need and their beneficent combination. Let's look into why we don't do that and whether we can actually build it ourselves. But equally, while you're doing that, you might find there's some killer counter-argument that says, sorry, you just can't do that. And I don't know what it is. I'm just saying we should be open to that.
No, I agree. And I think the call, really, the next step call is, can we start communities of practices that are working aligned in this one or something like this,
right,
you know?
Right.
And, but so this is but I really like the fact that these questions are asked immediately. So I call it a citizen's currency because when I work it out, the first step has to be bounded by the nation state. It gets crazy. So I've worked that out. So I call it a citizen's currency. So it would be limited at first because then there would have to be some changes. But the demand inside the nation would cause smart changes. So that's clear. And then there would have to be certain subsidies and trade agreements that enable the countries that want to try this to do this without disrupting everything. So that's why it's called a citizen's currency. And for those people working on blockchain, et cetera, it's actually a suggestion that they work at that scale and not at the scale of the internet, for example, which most people are working. So this is an interesting thing. It's less disruptive. Also, in terms of immigration, I've been thinking about it as a natural instrument to preserve and improve the immigration flows of farm workers. So it doesn't solve all of immigration, obviously, but these are ways in which you can take one simple idea and start to weave in some things like you just discussed that are important. But I do see it as bounded, unless somebody can think outside the box. I just see that it would require. But then there's there's the interest in having a little more kind of stepping back to a little more sense of nationhood already. So some of these things might be timely. Right.
I mean, for my part, I don't doubt that some version of a citizen's currency, and the citizen, could be citizen of the world potentially. But I can see why there would be good design reasons for beginning more locally. I also can hear people who are outraged because somehow for them it's almost a sacred notion that one works for one's own keep. And then I can see the critiques of that saying, well, that's all very well in principle, but we live in these thoroughly interconnected, highly urbanized worlds where it's just not that easy, and often you starve if you try.
Yeah.
So it's a complex picture. And I suppose my question back to you is, when we come up with an idea like this or a variation of it, and simultaneously you have other ideas that you gave in your list, and we know there are plenty of other ideas out there, there's a question of orientation, like where do you start the thinking process? Because one of the things that's been interesting about COVID and the pandemic is some people have begun to realize, okay, where do we start? So I noticed, for example, in ethical theory, there are sort of main schools of the Kantian or deontological view that certain things are good or bad in and of themselves. So saving life is a kind of preeminent necessity. But then you have a more consequential view, which is something like, well, we can't save all the lives, and if we do try and save all the lives, then we'll damage lots of other things, and so let's do the trade-offs, and that's another way of thinking. Then you have something like virtue theory, which is more about what are the inherent qualities of human character that we need to cultivate at this moment: care and kindness and reciprocity and things like this. Now those things are all swirling around, and I noticed in my own reaction that my inner Kantian became sort of heightened. When the pandemic broke, I was thinking, first save all the lives. So that was my very strong primal instinct. Like, just keep people inside, figure out what's going on, and let's see. Like, but let's at least, now that we understand, if you know what exponential functions look like, you can see that this could kill a lot of people very fast, and every day counts. And therefore, I took my children out of school early against government advice because I sensed this. Basically, my sense was first save all the lives, right? I only mention that because in a broader sense, when you're thinking of redesigning society or the economy at a potentially global scale, and you may have to start locally because, as you said, Andrew, and as Bonnie's emphasizing, it's all very well to have transcendental design, but you've got to do something the next day, and we need to start somewhere too. So there's this trade-off between knowing that the context is plural and planetary, but recognizing that action is often personal and specific and local. And in that context, what are the lodestars and touchstones? Well, health is certainly one of them. What does it mean to design an economy that's about health broadly conceived? And I know there are people who are thinking about that. Nora Bateson's one of them. And there's also the question of education, because as Zach argued in his compelling piece, there's a lot going on educationally at the moment. It's not just that kids are not in school. I know as a parent, I'm having to teach myself how to be a functional intermediary between the school's demands and the child's capabilities and desires. And that's not easy. It's a steep learning curve for all of us. And then there's the bigger question of, learning as a species-wide challenge to make sense of civilization and its purposes. And for that, you've got to think, well, if it's not indefinite economic growth, if we're not just trying to get richer and assuming it will somehow trickle down, what are we doing? And that's where I'm curious to ask Bonnie about the list, because it's like, okay, I can see that these are all interesting things to do, but what is their underlying dynamic? What are they? Are they aimed at the increase of love or well-being, or what is it? How do you orient yourself in that regard?
Yeah, so a couple of comments. Hopefully I remember them all. Excellent questions. So the first one is, yes, save all the lives. What's the trade-off that we're faced with, though? Save all the lives or ruin the economy? I mean, that's not very aspirational. How about save all the lives or build the world we want to see? Now it becomes very interesting. Now there's, you move from Kant to something like a Kierkegaardian imperative.
It's not goody and bad.
Yeah. So the notion of saving lives then becomes at once maybe more transcendental, but more primitive, right? People will, but that we don't have that, right? We don't have that. Save the lives or, save the economy. But we do have it. Save lives, save the economy, or take the saving of the lives response to look at something new. This is actually the third wave that's been coming out in this thing, Right. I'm sure that that's not what people really wanted to do. So that's one thing. The other thing is that you asked about healthcare, and this is why the interactive dynamics of the six are important, because healthcare depends a lot upon education. I think we should teach. If you live on a farm and you have a vet that you like, and you have a lot of animals, you basically do a lot of healthcare yourself, like a lot that it's not that hard. But most people don't know anything about their bodies or their immune system, or you can't even Google and understand anything. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't know how to eat. All of this inflates, this big systemic need for this big behemoth type of healthcare. This is true in all Western cultures. It's beginning to be more true in the Eastern cultures. So if you had more education around healthcare, then you could have more distributed nodes for caring. And so that's one thing, and I'll get back to education. But the connection piece really helps healthcare, because the problem is we're not connected to how we are human, how our health is part of the living world. We're not connected to how we do our forestry is part of our healthcare system. What the decisions we make on land use is part of our healthcare system. The decisions we make in animal husbandry, which is why we have swine flu, avian flu, and coronavirus, is part of our health insurance, healthcare. So we need to cultivate this sense of originary connection. That itself solves a lot. We're not even connected to our bodies, like the comorbidities around diabetes and COVID-19 are huge, right? So, and diabetes is much more, is a much larger and more dangerous pandemic, because the young kids, it's just infecting all the global for long term. So the connection piece works with the healthcare, education with healthcare. But you also said, I'm not into giving young people basic income and free college. And so part of the education piece, which I know is a very big piece because you and I are working on it, is to have work-study college credits, so that just like the GI Bill, and those credits would come from working in education, healthcare, environment, things like hospice, and farm and food. So you have this like perfect circle. And so then when people go to college, and this is proven to be true, they're more respectful, they're more informed of what college means or what college can be. And so I would stop. Here I go. I'll never run for office in this country. I would stop subsidizing all higher education, and
Really?
and use that subsidy and let people who have the money go, because basically let them go and try to preserve the world that makes them rich. That's what education does. It teaches you how to preserve the world for rich people. I would use that money instead to design these from, I think it starts in my project, it starts from 16 to 18 years old. You start to have avocational support for working in the society, and then you can get work credits for going to higher education, whatever that may look like at that time. So a lot of this stuff is like, if we had enough conversations, you could see they're all deeply embedded in each other.
I'm absolutely sure of that, not just having read it, but knowing of your other work, and also just knowing of the kinds of conundrum that are faced. I guess I'm just curious about, when I got my original question, why this list, not another list? There are lots of books out there with in effect 10-point plans for how civilization renews itself. And many of them are a little bit open-ended, but they're still like that. And in all cases, I have two main qualms. One is there's something about the planning nature of it that troubles me. It's that it's insufficiently receptive to what might come, insufficiently curious about, almost, there's that joke about man plans, God laughs, that sort of thing. It's as if we could figure it out when there's so much that's beyond our control. But there's also this issue of underlying value, a kind of, I suppose it's sort of meta ethics in a way. It's sort of thinking about what are the real ultimate values that are driving the endeavor. So I don't doubt that the 6 points you raise could spin us towards, or what would the right metaphor be? It would move us towards, or somehow
Tumble.
tumble towards, something like that. Playfully fall down the hill towards, whatever. Basically, I agree that could be the case. But I'm curious, in order to make decisions, do we or do we not need some kind of underlying commitment to certain core virtues or processes of understanding virtues, or whatever that is there not some underlying aspect, or am I looking for something that just isn't there?
No. So
can I just say one thing? When you're talking, what I'm hearing Jonathan say maybe is that we need a metaphysical system as well as just this idea of changing stuff, like a religion or something. A religion is a metaphysical system that sort of keeps the society together. And is that fair, John?
Thanks, Andrew. And just to quickly spin on that before Bonnie comes in. Yes, metaphysics. I know Bonnie's written about that, so it's an interesting chance for her to go into that. It's not just metaphysics, though. So it is something about ultimate commitments. I suppose it's also about the rhetorical function of the plan. There's something about making sense to people of why we should do X and not Y by appealing to Z.
Meaning, right? Meaning. What's the meaning of what we're doing?
Well, maybe, Andrew, but the point is you say meaning, someone else says happiness, someone else says justice, someone else says diversity, someone else says health. And I want to know how you're going to deal with that. Or are you just going to say, everyone's welcome, we can do it together? Bring all your values with you. Like, how do we solve that conundrum?
How do we solve that conundrum in a lazy Taoist way, maybe?
Maybe. Let's hear it.
Yeah.
Yes, the thing is designed to solve itself. So I just step back. No, that's kind of a joke. Okay, so here are different ways to look at it. One is it's informed by a lot of key features of my work, right? Release complexity, self-organization. It's designed so if people buy in, then you really have a lot of experiments going on. It's not a top-down thing. This notion of releasing complexity, this notion of the different type of meta move it is, and the fact that it like literally almost killed me to write it. Like, what do you want to say? Right. And so maybe it's only authentic to one person, but all these things depend upon timing, like, is there sufficient, is this speaking to other people, what they can't get out of themselves, And I had a community call the other day, and people there's a lot of people close to saying certain similar things, but they don't say it in public because it seems like retro-romanticism. You asked that question, and it has all these, maybe they're not, I get away with it because I've been writing complex metaphysics. So people think, well, she must be smart. I mean, basically, that's one of the reasons why people like Zach and I get away with saying these things. Right. Because we've had to prove that, yes, all of that, and yet there's something else, right? So that's part of it. And the question is Wilbur. I mean, Wilbur's work was great, but it was also timely. He didn't say anything that wasn't said in little places elsewhere.
Yeah.
But but I believe he spoke. He went through the same process. And I don't know if this is going to be a big deal or not, but it's one of those things for me. That's one thing. But the other thing you're talking about is yes, because you're so astute. There are, underneath it, you could say, what are as I said, the spirituality we need? What are the ontological, epistemological, and metaphysical and axiological commitments that we need today? Right. And I think you can see from that short video I did that is what underlies this. But of course, that's all I can say. So that's why I know there's also this deeper holism. It's me trying to come to terms with who am I at this time in history as a person, given all the work I've done, and can that be helpful? Basically.
This is interesting to me. It seems like rather than a bunch of commandments, that you're talking about commitments that we should make that are based in this moment of time. Is that am I understanding you? Which is that's a different thing than saying we should always, thou shalt not kill, or it's more like, okay, right now, we're not going to build a thing to go to the moon, right? That's inappropriate in this time. Maybe the whole discussion about going to Mars feels to me kind of inappropriate when wildfires are burning in, in Australia. So what are those? What do you think?
Yeah.
Those?
I mean, the first thing is to realize you have them, and then you say, "Well, are these good? Are these actually?" A lot of people have commitments that are not in the direction of the values they espouse, and that's why they never get anything done.
So I have watched the video Bonnitta alluded to. I've also seen the text because I edited, very lightly edited it because it was great as it was, which will go online shortly, actually. But what she's alluding to is a series by Bruce Alderman about the spirituality of tomorrow, or the one we need today, or which is effectively the same thing in some ways. And it was a particularly cogent piece where Bonnie does kind of lay out her metaphysics of choice. And they include commitments to axiology, which is roughly the sort of structure of value or underlying premises of value and goodness and so forth. Epistemology, which is about how do we know and how should we know. Ontology, roughly what is real, what is the world made of, and what do we know to be real, what is there. And then also your fourth one.
Process metaphysics.
Process metaphysics, which in some ways is what I wanted to get to, yeah. So the thing about a process metaphysics that's very relevant in regard to my question is that it's inherently somewhat provisional, right? It's inherently
non-Kantian.
Yeah.
Right, unkantian, right.
Unkantian, yeah.
Right, unkantian.
It's creative.
So if you're committed to a process metaphysics, then giving any given list is a way of saying this is where we are in the process at the moment. Right, the list is a way of the process unfolding and speaking. And you, in answer to the question of why these points and not others, you can give more or less good cartographical references, saying, well, I actually touched all the four quadrants of Wilbur's map, and this is a little bit aperspectival in Gebser's theory, and it's this and that. You can do that, and your list may look more or less credible as a result. I suppose the thing I'm trying to get to is that enough? Is that as much as we can do? And if so, let's just get on with it. Or is it more, is it that there's another way of doing this such that you bring together the best and the brightest, as it were, bring in all the lists, everyone has their 10-point plan, and there's 1,000 of them. And then you whittle that down to one 10-point plan at the end because that's the one that survived. That doesn't seem right. That seems bogus, right? And I'm wondering, the reason it seems bogus is something about the nature of in your model, knowing, valuing, being, and what upholds all of that is radically perspectival. In other words, it depends upon the context and the person. It's not true for everyone and always necessarily. And therefore, all you can do is say, this is what I think we should do next, given our best available knowledge and judgment. And if that's the case, good luck. Like maybe that's all there is.
Yeah, and I also tried to highlight what's possible. Okay, there's a lot going on. It's always like playing a fairly extraordinarily rich chess game with Jonathan.
Yeah.
Because every new move is so many more possibilities, although it doesn't have this competitive feel to it. So
can I maybe throw in one little thing? When you're talking about process philosophy, it seems to be a kind of a creative process of unknowing, and then there is also maybe the need for metaphysical certainty of some kinds on the other side, right? Like don't do any harm, right? That might be a kind of a universal Kantian category. So I'm almost feeling the two worlds, let's say a Buddhistic world or Eastern world or Taoist world and a Kantian Christian worldview being sort of compared to each other.
Yeah, and I want to say to all my Taoist friends, I mean, I call myself a Taoist, but I've obviously upgraded what that I think that means to me. I mean, some Taoists are very, there's all kinds of Taoists, but a lot of commonalities. But what I think is interesting, I think any list would be fine. It doesn't matter, maybe exactly how you do the steps, but these features that it releases complexity, doesn't use the metasynthetic mind, that it arises from some deep inner sensing, and that means it's going to be backed by these other commitments. Deep inner sensing is you're kind of tracking through some kind of set of commitments. So you have to know what those commitments are, if that could be explicated. Also, I try to work, to release complexity. I try to work with things that are already underway. Right. The one that's the most emergent is digital naturalism.
Right.
I try to also ask the coronavirus, like, what are you telling us? So that's the food to farm thing, and the way people were working and with making bread, and like the other day I saw this guy who generally sells eggs to restaurants was going to have to cull his flock, and he went straight to Facebook, and he sold like 2 months of eggs over Facebook. This is the move. Like, you just go directly, and now the system has to breathe food here, and then it has to move food here. This is the move. I try to work with innate intelligence and pro-social impulses of human.
Right.
So there's certain kinds of things, if somebody else if they have these deeper touch points, then maybe it could be any other list. But I don't think there's if you had all those touch points, I don't think there's a whole lot of wiggle room in what you'd come up with.
I wanted to ask you about like hyper objects too. You mentioned the word hyper object, and it seems, I don't know if I understand what that means exactly. Maybe people could benefit from understanding that. But I wonder if removing the hyper object to have a more direct relationship with the world is a bit what you're talking about. Does that?
I can just briefly speak to that. I know you were asking Bonnie, but there was a reason I wanted to come in, which was that I think this is one of the more exciting features of Bonnita's thought, because I spend a lot of time with people who speak about the collapse of civilization and the designing of a new one. Game B is a complex, tested notion, but a lot of people in that world do think in terms of something like a transcendental design in which you think it all through and map out what this world would be like with different underlying principles, different motivations, different incentive structures, different technologies, different feedback loops, and so it goes on. Whenever I hear those things, they don't feel altogether real. And it's not because I don't think we need that kind of thinking. It's because there's something about the getting from here to there that is sort of ignored, as if somehow the process of getting from A to B was not itself part of the story, rather than just what's A and what's B. And so this idea of working with what's already there and sort of building...
Very important, yeah.
Yeah, it's very important. And so when Bonnita asks, it's just worth noticing, what is the coronavirus saying to us? It's a very interesting way of posing the question.
I feel it to be profoundly ethical, but not moralistic. Like, we're looking at the complex situation. We're not imposing a sort of moralistic map of or even, let's say, trying to engineer this this utopian society. We're trying to really work with the forces that are moving through us and our communities and whatever happens to appear, which might be coronavirus right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I want to hear what Bonnie wants to say about hyperobjects, but I also have something to add, because I only feel in the last few days I've really made my peace with hyperobjects in a certain sense. So,
this is work I've been doing for a long time, as Jonathan, and that is, I've for a long time believed that the complexity in human consciousness, as measured by hierarchical developmental stage theory, is a product of adapting to an information economy in a capitalist society. Now, actually, the early Taoists talked about this in terms of ethics. They said, they'll have their principles. Don't touch your brother's wife. And then they'll say, well, what if she falls in the water? And then they have context. But when they argued with the Moists, they said you don't want to have more and more complex rules, because then you'll have to pay a few people. You won't know what they're talking about, and the average person cannot make a moral decision. So they predicted that the way complex thinking works in the moral sphere is highly problematic. Now this is not about that, but what I would say is that here's the challenge to smart people today. The challenge is not to design double and triple loop systems. It's to design single loop feedback systems that work. They're inherently inclusive of everyone, including young people. And that's what I'm doing. Everyone knows how to use currency. This move to making systems more and more and more complex is inherently a rivalrous move in a capitalist information economy. Now, you don't have to buy into that. It's highly provocative. I happen to believe it, and some people are starting to also come around to it. Roy Bhaskar, for example, this was his critique of Wilber's taxonomy. So that's that. So this moving and hyperobjects is that move, just taking things and making them more and more complex in hierarchical complexity.
But Bonnie, can I come in there? Because two things there. One is I'd love to hear more about what exactly you mean there. You seem to be saying that the impulse to understand cognitive complexity through developmental models is somehow beholden to the capital informational infrastructure, and therefore not exactly beholden, but it's sort of shaped by it and serves it in a certain sense.
No, I would put it a little cleaner than that. Developmental stage models correctly reflect what's happening. But that's not because our mind is like that. That's because it's a mind that's developed in a rivalrous. Okay, yeah. So it's called the empirical fallacy.
Right. Okay.
They got evidence that that's happening, but they act as if this is a deep structure of the mind.
I see. Okay. Brilliant. So it's not. So in some ways, you could say it's epistemology claiming to be ontology, something like that.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Got it. Right. So the next question was about hyperobjects, because only recently do I feel. I read Timothy Morton's Being Ecological some time ago. I've spoken to a few of my trusted intellectual friends about the nature of hyperobjects. And it took me a while. I, like you, originally saw this as primarily a hyper-abstract way of framing things, almost putting it beyond the reach of cognitive understanding. But there's a more generous way to view Morton, and I got to this through Gene Johnson and his work on Gebser, but also more generally thinking about what Zach's been saying about, he keeps saying that the intellectual function is sort of defeated by the hyperobjects. And by that he means the pandemic at scale is beyond any single mind to understand. Climate change at scale is beyond any single mind. Even the notions of inequality or democracy or...
Yeah, these are all examples of hyperobjects. Yeah. I'm just saying that for the people.
So they tend to have this function of being simultaneously present and absent. So sort of diffuse in their influence and reference, and yet simultaneously present and real, such that we refer to them and they're part of our experience, but we can't pin them down. They're not tangible. Now, the more generous way of viewing hyperobjects comes about through a sort of going beyond perspectival thinking. So going beyond the lists, going beyond the conceptual categories, going beyond the taxonomies and the blueprints and the game theoretic understandings, and saying, no, just ground it in your own experience. The hyperobject's a way of saying that function has limitations. It's not saying here is the apotheosis of the intellect. It's saying the intellect must surrender.
That's why we have archetypes and symbols and stuff too, right? So it's just sort of an uber archetype, a big.
Well, yeah. As I understand it, and this is why it's exciting, and Bonnie can correct me on this, but as I understand it, one of the reasons people like Gebser are exciting is precisely because those ways of thinking, the more magic, mythic kind of perspectives, are coming back. People are reaching for them, and and feeling more and more attuned to them. And that's partly because the more mental structures that we've been living with predominantly for the last decades and centuries are losing their preeminence. They're still there. We still need them. You don't throw your intellect out lightly. You sort of need it. But there are other things going on. One of the things that's going on is this kind of aperspectival view, which is not a way of saying you don't take perspective or you don't have concepts, but it's sort of recognizing that you can experience the whole thing and not be able to explain it conceptually. And that's partly what's going on with the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, but also with bigger issues like climate change. When people speak about the meta crisis, what they're alluding to is the ineffable wholeness of our existential predicament expressed in systemic terms that are beyond my understanding. And that's where hyperobjects are a bit more like your friend. They're a bit more like, okay, I see why I can't get that. It's a hyperobject. And that's okay because there's a limit to what I can understand because I'm a single human being with epistemic limitations. And that's how I see it. But.
So it's a necessary kind of short form for communication between people to understand things that are beyond our understanding.
I'll let Bonnie come in now. I mean, I can read.
I agree with you. I think that just like all these new waves of understanding, they morph and they get popularized. And I'm mostly critiquing the popularized version. When I teach Timothy Morton, I always teach hyperobjects in conjunction to his other book, which I can't remember what the title of it is, but the subtitle is something about, really having relationships with the non-living world. It's a type of neo-animism. And I think the two have to go hand in hand. And the second version is usually much more foreign to people, that objects you can participate with objects. They're non-trivial. I like to say, for example, that coffee moves 1 billion people every morning. And I don't mean it in a trivial way. This is, if you investigate, what catalyzes your actions. In many cases, they're what we would call objects. So those two pieces have to come together for me in understanding Timothy Morton. But yes, if you look at the different ways to understand hyperobjects, I agree with you. Yeah. So maybe that could be a whole.
Well, what's interesting about it vis-a-vis your list of 6 things we should sort of do, is that they're somewhere straddled between the perspectival and the aperspectival. They're sort of, it's a bridge from one to the other. It's like where you want to get to are these tacit understandings based on embeddedness in nature and relationship, right? But to get there, you need to build this sort of quasi-conceptual bridge that has practice built into it, so that we know where we're going to some extent.
Yeah, and it has to have, it has to be anchored in the real dynamics of the real world. Like, is it possible to have a currency like that? Is it possible to track a food chain? These things are possible.
What I wanted to ask you, Bonnie, about that, if it's okay with Andrew, is that, the other critique that could come, one is the sort of, this is just eco-romanticism. The other critique that I didn't mention that I could now is how much you're assuming about human goodwill. How much we're assuming that our better natures are latent, waiting to come out, and just need the right systems and structures to elicit them. And to what extent are we just morally compromised and self-interested? And there will always be a critical mass of people in any given group who will seek to subvert the commons and subvert patterns of collaboration for their own selfish advantage. I know that people like Daniel Schmachtenberger is very clear that this is one of the main problems where he doesn't really trust in anything within our current competitive system, is that as long as those people are there, they will ultimately destroy things for everyone. And so I suppose I'm just curious to know where you are with that, because you sometimes speak as though there is this better nature that's universal, but I'm just not sure if that's the case.
I would say that you have to have an optimistic, you have to be able to imagine optimistically, but not that people are good. So, for example, one of the hopes in something like this is, I wanted to just bring in, when we were talking about working with what we have, that's a big thing in Dave Snowden's work of exaptation, right? And I think that we should also work with what we have in terms of people. People are good and people are not so good, or whatever. What I see, though, however, is the reality of the moral quandary we have as people now is not that we're not good intentioned. It's that there's good intentions funneled through perverse incentives. And I think everything, like people are like, can't that currency be gamed? I'm like, yeah, sure. Any currency can be gamed, but there's a lot less it can do. So, you can't invest in, you can't stockpile it. You can't. So you want a lot of little transgressions. This is one of the problems with Bitcoin. I think they're working on it with Holochain successfully, because Holochain has different levels of permissions. So closed circles can be a lot more wiggle room. But a lot of Bitcoin, blockchain technology imagines a transgressless society, right, which is like a dead society. I mean, our values and our ways of imagining ourselves evolve, and they always come online. They emerge as deviant forms. So this is something to think about in terms of going forward. And there's also something about, if you start to look at how nature is composed itself, right, versus the systems that we make. We want to always make systems that, can't be gamed, or systems that, whatever, retreat or withdrawal. But things like cheating and parasitism, all these things are highly evolutionary in nature. And so that's, again, a lot of this conversation, and it's hard for me too, so I'm not saying, not just throwing stones here. A lot of this conversation is from the impression that the system is big, and system number one, the big. We can hardly use that word and not think of nature as a system. It's so distributed. It's not even a system because it's so open. Yeah. And so part of this work, if people wanted to work on this approach, is helping each other even understand what we mean when we talk about that kind of system. Yeah. Because it's not bounded in, and so if I have a really good series of articles in Medium. That sounded self-promotional, but it goes through like the different levels of system thinking, 0 level, which is just participation, right. All the way. And it shows all the moves that are made by the mind to increase the complexity of those systems. And so what you can do with that analysis is systematically work back. So for example, at a certain level of systems thinking, you de-animate some part of the system. Right. And there's a liability to that. Mm-hmm. So, I think that Nora Bateson, you, people in our community, Dave Snowden, we're all trying to figure out the language and what is it to talk about this kind of process or dynamics that doesn't, so that's kind of a challenge.
You said de-animating the system, which I thought was kind of interesting, because in these theoretical two worlds, the problem with the present world is there's a lot of dead structures, right, that need to be kind of de-animated, that need to kind of fall apart before more positive structures can emerge.
Yeah, what I meant by that is like the original sin of the ecological management movement. We can manage the ecosystem so that we are active and the ecosystem's de-animated. And this is one of this is the original sin of what I would call holistic systems thinking is you
It's kind of control, right? It's a mania for controlling whatever situation.
It could come from good intentions, but you noticed you say, I'm subject, you're object to that. And whenever you do that, then the system is going to come back to bite you, right? Or in management systems, management thinking, different theories of management show how you can, they envision the workers as being agents, but then the manager can step outside and see it as a human system and act on it. Right? So now I have a privileged position from which I can act on the system. Well, this is not true in it's not true of nature. It's not true of the coronavirus. This is exactly what the mental model is of coronavirus, that we can act on something. That's not true. You have to take a different orientation, and understanding what the orientation is really good work. But that's just one. There's 9, I think, different features of systems thinking that can move you to this other way of being with complexity.
So that begs the question: is like, how do we act? And with what is our agency and all of these things? And part of that is, I guess, activity, and part of that is like, you're the Taoist king and you're just facing south, and that's how you rule your kingdom, not by messing with whatever's going on. Sorry, Jonathan, you wanted to
well, just to sort of echo, I haven't read Bonnie's piece on, it sounds fascinating, on different ways of understanding systems thinking, but I am aware of the fact that there's a lot of talk of changing the system, a lot of talk of systems change, and not that much reflection on what we mean precisely by system, nor the scales that applies to: micro, macro, and meso, and everything else in between. And then the different kinds of systems, such that, the sort of self-organizing system that is the mind is very, very different from the kind of system that is the virus.
And again, I like what you're saying. Maybe it isn't even a system. Maybe the ecosystem is not a system. Maybe, but we're so used to thinking in those terms, but they're not exactly correct.
I think what I'm sort of, maybe in a sense, pulling my punches a bit. I just feel systems thinking, unless it's given the kind of texture that Bonnita's pointing to, risk being hollow. It risks being a kind of picking something out of the social surround to sound clever, to sound insightful, but to really feel systems and to recognize one's participation in them is an altogether more exacting, challenging task, because, as Bonnie says, we have multiple systems inside of us. There is a sense in which we are one system ourselves, but then we're embedded in many others. So to even speak of systems is to bring into the room like thousands of layers of complexity. And okay, there's no point in getting lost in that. You need to get back to and therefore. But just that we maybe need to refine our conception of, when we say system, I mean X. Just as when we say, when I say capitalism, I mean this version of it, or when I say democracy, I mean the liberal democratic version. Likewise with system, changing the system, I've often felt was a bit hollow as an injunction.
Also, it has a kind of ingratitude for, we've got to this point in culture and we've been struggling with it. And if you just want to change the system, there's this deep, deep history that the system comes from.
Right.
And people have this tendency to want to wipe everything away in this sort of blank slate.
That's I think the heart
kind
of
of.
I think that's the point we keep turning to, and there's a good reason for that, and that's what is uniquely Bonnita's in some ways, for me at least, because I am also wrestling with that being in communities where the language is very much of things have to die before they can be reborn, and we need to tear down capitalism, and democracy is finished, and none of this quite rings true, and yet it doesn't ring wholly false either. There is a sense in which the interlocking pressures of multiple systemic breakdowns and their relationship does mean we're encountering something like existential risks, if not catastrophic risks. And I think that's kind of right. But when it comes to what to do, we don't have the option of starting from ground zero. Like, it's just not there. What we have instead is our next move in chess terms. The position is what the position is. The pieces are what the pieces are. Mm-hmm. You can play better or worse, but it's your move. That's how I see it. And yeah, to make a good move, you need to think ahead, certainly. And you need to learn from what you've done wrong in the past, right? But don't think you can just wipe the pieces away and start again. It's not how life is.
Yeah, and I think that I love, there's a lot you just said there, so I'm going to pick out some gems. So you said the mind is a self-organizing, adaptive, self-organizing system. Now, the mind has complex feed loops, right? So that some areas, when they get excited, inhibit other areas, and those maybe inhibit other areas. So when they inhibit this, it's very complex. And so the moves we make or the thoughts we have are threshold events. Like, literally, if I'm like, should I go to the store or not? Both those are in me, sub-threshold at the same time until one happens. And the reason why this is adaptive is the same reason why when you're receiving a serve, even moving in the wrong direction is better than standing still, right? So now if you look at coronavirus and we say, what is the self-organizing collective intelligence of coronavirus? Well, what you would want to see is a lot of things going on all the time. The information ecology rich with alternatives until you have a threshold event. And that's what we have. So now all of a sudden, instead of like having a sense-making breakdown, the freaking war on sense-making, you actually see the system is doing what it needs to do in complex environments. Now, there's too much need for people to want one answer. And this is where you destroy the self. So you can start to see, I call it, there's a term I use, still hunting, where you just all the information ecology, I don't know what to make of it, but it's changing the way I no longer feel like I'm lost. Like, it's this need to think, well, what is the answer? And then if this, then that is actually more confusing than watching the self-organized collective intelligence. And we need to make that information ecology more robust. But when that New York doctor, New York knew that it was coming their way. And when he got out and said, look, I'm a pulmonary surgeon or whatever, a respiratory expert. And he says, I've never seen something like this before. This is not pneumonia. And he came on like YouTube. And then scientists looked at all these different studies and all these different ways of experimenting with respirators versus ventilators. This was in real time, and this has never happened before. The professional career of the doctor would have been at risk and all this stuff. So the same thing that you can look at as a breakdown in sense-making, I see as emergent ways of working with complexity at that level. And you want to see a lot of sub-threshold experiments. I think Sweden is marvelous for doing their own experiment. Geopolitically, they're able to get away with it, but you can start to see, and then if you can start to see that it's already happening, let's do more of this and less of that. It's not entirely new.
Actually, I feel quite good about this as a kind of sort of conclusion, because it makes me feel less gloomy about humanity in terms of its self-organizing potential. you have something you want to add to that, Jonathan? What Bonnitta said?
Well, just to sort of echo it, really. I suppose that I would add just this, that it very much encapsulates what I'm experiencing in my current role, which involves working with a lot of people who are thinking at this level of complexity at a time when people are desperate for answers. And there's also, I think, a certain fetishization of different types of critique, which I'm a little bit guilty of myself sometimes. The desire to solve a problem, the desire to see civilization-wide phenomena as if they were essentially problems that could be solved, rather than a kind of predicament or pickle that we're all caught up in together, and that we have to experience more deeply somehow, and then find felicitous action, find a way of doing something meaningful and real and useful, but in a way that is not anti-intellectual, in a way that doesn't say, oh, you and your funny ideas, I'm going to go be practical and do something. No, these two things are needed together. We've never needed praxis more. And naive positivity, we don't need either. In some ways, the predicament is objectively, well, it's subjectively dark, but objectively quite precarious, you could say. And yet, the hope arises from the action. It's not that you have the hope and then you act. It's that you find something meaningful to do, begin doing it, and you find what's mobilized then is all sorts of interesting ideas of what to do next. And I think in that sense, Bonitta's really helped with this essay series, because it gives you an idea of, here's some things we can build, what's stopping us. And yeah, there are qualms, and yes, there are questions about how and when and who. But the key thing is to begin something where you have confidence that this is a beneficial move.
Yeah.
And not to wait for the big master plan.
Yeah, I love the fact that it's a kind of not naive optimism, in the sense is just recognizing the resources that we have that are already there.
It's an authentic positivity. I have a colleague, Shan Ferguson, who came up with this term. I find it very useful. It's the positivity on the other side of the analysis of negativity. It's like what you do when you face up to the problem, but still have to act. It's not everything's going to be okay. It's not everything is okay. It's things are difficult. Now what do we do? Yeah.
And like in wartime or something, even in whatever the situation is, it can be very, very dark and very, very terrible. There's still some sparkling of creativity happening at the same time, and so there's this double-edged sword, or two worlds again that are happening simultaneously, I think, right now, which Bonnita expresses very well in her vision.
We don't have to answer it now, but I mean, one of the things I'm left with is I'm never quite sure what we should want at a civilization-wide level. It's just not my. If someone asked me to sketch utopia, I would really struggle. There's something, and I say struggle a little bit ironic. I say that because in some ways, for me, the struggle that we face now is quite close to how I want to live. It's like having these big conundrums to wrestle with and try and act on is in its own way beautiful. Now, it's not to say I wouldn't want things to be more peaceful. I don't want people to be tortured or starve. I don't want delusional forms of wealth that lead to others being destroyed through poverty. I don't want ecological suicide. There are clear things that we can do that a sane person could agree on. But beyond that, painting a picture of how you want the ultimate world to be, that's beyond me. I can't quite conceive of a world of optimal conflict in that way. I don't know if others can. I'm curious about that. But I think what I can relate to, and where Bonitta's really helping, is thinking about next steps.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything that you would like to close off with, Bonnita? Anything that's hanging around in the conversation that you would like to kind of perhaps conclude?
I mean, I just really
Okay.
appreciate that reflecting back what Jonathan said. And, you know, I would just say it in a different way, you know, how the world is not up to us, but how we act in the world we have is. So